Hi, my name is Wendy Jacobson, and this is about the day I found out my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. It actually was sometime in the evening, either towards the very end of March or early April of 1995. I was a couple years out of college, living in Washington, D.C. My family was back in Minneapolis, which is where I was from. And I remember I had a message on our answering machine from my mom asking me to give her a call back. Actually, it was from my mom telling me to give her a call back. The message was very flat and pretty emotionless. And I remember thinking that was weird because my mom usually left fun messages for me. So I knew something was wrong. And although I was nervous to do so, I gave her a call back, and she told me in a matter-of-fact way that she had been diagnosed with breast cancer. I don't really remember much about the conversation in terms of the details that she shared. I think she told me that she was going to have a double mastectomy followed by chemotherapy, and that she would beat it and that I shouldn't be too worried. So that didn't really help calm my nerves. I remember hanging up the phone, being alone in my apartment. I did have a roommate, but she was out, and not really sure what to do or how to feel. I felt scared, obviously, and I felt like I really wanted to see my mom. And fortunately, I had the opportunity to go home a couple weeks later for Passover, and so a couple weeks after that conversation, I was able to see my mom. And I just remember thinking, wow, this cancer has really just overtaken her, just in terms of how she was acting and who she was, and it was all she talked about, and she was very consumed by it, which obviously is very understandable. But it was very different for me because my mom was always mind over matter, very headstrong, determined, career person, very confident, great dresser, but just, it just seemed like this cancer had just weakened her emotionally and mentally so much. It was just, I wasn't ready for that, and I wasn't ready for the constant talking about the cancer. And I remember being with my parents, bringing my mom to a doctor's appointment, and we dropped her off, and my dad and I went and parked the car, and I just remember saying to my dad, God, that's all she talks about. And my dad agreed, but that's how she processed it, and that's how she dealt with it. And I came to realize that later. But I was scared that this was what it was going to be like, and it was just so consuming. And truth be told, now when I think about it, I was really kind of relieved to get out of Minneapolis and go back to D.C. As much as I wanted to be there for my parents and help my dad, support my mom, and all that stuff. For me, it was just too much. And so I think escaping that was a way for me maybe to escape the reality of the situation. It turns out that when my mom got the diagnosis, it was stage 4. It was in her bones. They had taken out 16 lymph nodes when they did the biopsy, and it turns out that 14 of the 16 were cancerous. They gave my mom a 10% chance of surviving longer than 6 months and told her to go home and get her affairs in order and spend time with her family. I didn't actually know this at that time. I found that part out years later when my mom wrote her book, which I'll tell you about a little bit later. But, the prognosis was horrible, and my mom, of course, was terrified. And so, in terms of the treatment that my mom had after the double mastectomy, which she had in May of 1995, and then several rounds of chemo, my mom and dad opted for my mom to have a bone marrow transplant. And I remember at the time that treatment was really kind of radical and new for cancer patients, I understand, and they had to fight the insurance company to get them to pay for it. But if she didn't have this bone marrow transplant, there was really nothing else that they could have done for her. I mean, she would have died. So she had that maybe the end of 1995 or beginning of 1996. She was in the hospital for a month after in isolation, and then she came home. And when she came home from that, I came home to see her, and it was, you know, it was tough. My mom was beaten down, and really had to fight to get back, but she did. She fought her way back and recovered from that, and was cancer-free for several years. And it was that experience that led my mom to make the commitment to herself that if she survived, she would help other people who were facing a life-threatening disease. I mean, this was my mom. I remember her explaining it like the rug had been just taken out from under her, and she had been put through the ringer in, you know, like a 9-month time frame, and she had a great support network, but she realized that not everyone did, and so she wanted to be able to give back to others, and she did just that. She got really involved in the local Coleman organization, and you know, was just there to help other people who were dealing with a life-threatening disease, and lived cancer-free. She lived cancer-free until I think either 2001 or 2002, when it had come back to the exact same spot, but they couldn't do surgery. It was attached to a bone. So they did radiation, and actually the cancer had metastasized into her stomach as well as small intestine. So from that point on, she lived with cancer, managing it with chemo. She would be on a chemo and stayed on a chemo until it stopped working, and then she tried a new chemo. In 2003, she had surgery to remove a portion of her small intestine that where the cancer was, and you know, she managed it. And that's what she wanted to do. But she lived with cancer while maintaining a very high quality of life. Luckily, she didn't get sick from the chemo, and she and my dad were able to do things that, you know, were important to her. She was able to kind of reevaluate her life and do things and spend time with the people that are important. So she, like I said, she and my dad traveled a lot. She took up hobbies. She got really into beading and made jewelry and sold her jewelry. I think she took up weaving because there was a loom all of a sudden one day at her house. And then she got to spend time with her grandchildren, and more particularly with my son Ethan, who was born in 2004, November 2004. And she wanted to be a grandma more than anything, and so I think she took his birth as a reason to fight even harder. So she made sure she was around for his birth. My daughter was born in March of 2007, and my mom sadly didn't get to spend a whole lot of time with her because she started to get sick. My mom started to get sick, and in September of 2007, she realized that something didn't feel quite right in her hip. Finally went to the doctor and realized that she had broken her hip without falling. I mean, the cancer was in her bones, so I'm sure that caused it. So she had a hip replacement, and as a result of that, she had to go off chemo, and she never quite recovered. So she was in either the hospital or in rehab until she died in January 9th, 2008. On New Year's Eve, on December 31st, 2007, she met with her doctors, and they told her that they had done everything that they could for her, but it was time to set up hospice. And so she went home, and we had hospice care set up, and 9 days later, on January 9th, she took her last breath with me and my sister and my dad by her side. And you know, she wanted to live, and she lived a very good life for as long as she could. But I think, you know, she told my dad the night before she died, actually, that she was ready to go, being taken care of, losing control of her body. Those were not who my mom was, and I think she realized that that was going to be the new reality for her. And, you know, even before that, you know, November of 2007, when my mom was kind of withdrawing and kind of going through that dying process. I read about the dying process, what a person goes through when they're actually dying. I read about that in a hospice book. You know, my mom just wasn't herself, obviously, and it was just a very interesting. I don't know if interesting is the right word, but I just remember that time, you know, being really scared that my mom was going to die, but none of us talked about it. And she had fought cancer for so long, for almost 13 years, and we never ever talked about what happens if she died. You know, not amongst each other. I talked about it a little bit with my husband, but, you know, it was just, and sadly, that's the reality for a lot of people who have cancers, that they will die, and that's really sad and unfortunate, but that's the reality of it. And I think, I wish that looking back on it, if I could do it again, I just wish there was more open communication about that within my family. And I remember feeling guilty for thinking that my mom was going to die because we never talked about it. And, does that mean that I think she's weak? Of course not. But I just remember thinking that I shouldn't think about what happens if she dies, because I don't think she's thinking about it, because they're not talking about it. I think she and my dad did talk about it, obviously, but just not with us. She and my dad had an interesting way of communicating with us, which I respect. They told us what was important, and obviously the good news. They didn't always share the bad news. As I mentioned, when my mom was initially diagnosed, she had a 10% chance of living longer than 6 months. I found that fact out years later when I read the manuscript of her book. And I was a little upset that I found out that important fact by reading her book. But, my parents chose to do things their way, and I respect them for that. So the book my mom wrote, she started in 2006. She, up until that point, for some reason, I don't know how or why, or I guess it doesn't matter, people sought my mom out for support, for inspiration, what have you. I mean, people really got inspired by my mom's story and just wanted her advice or her ear or her shoulder, and she gladly gave that. I mean, it just gave her such a sense of purpose, and she wanted to reach more people. So she wrote a book called Hands Off My Hope, Life Lessons on My Journey with Breast Cancer, because she learned so much about not only herself and the healthcare system, but about her friends and family. A lot of people, when they found out she was sick, couldn't deal with it, her closest friends even. And, that was a process that she went through with the healthcare system. When she was given that diagnosis, she told her doctor, I don't accept that. That might be what the tests are showing you, but I'm going to be in that 10%. And there were times where she found other doctors. She had to fight her insurance company to pay for treatment. I mean, her message is, just because you're given a diagnosis of cancer doesn't mean you're given a diagnosis of death. It's your body. You're in control. You're in control of how you navigate this disease, and you need to do it your way. She was very headstrong, and this is what she wanted to do, but she understood that not everybody is like that. And she also understood that not everybody has such a huge support network. She would often say that there's no way she would have gotten through it without her family and friends. So she wanted to help people who maybe didn't have that big support and be there as a support or part of their support network with the lessons that she learned through cancer. So she started writing that in 2006. It was really a labor of love. She was so excited about it and was able to finish it and get it published in December of 2008, about a month before she died. 2007, about a month before she died. And she saw it in print, but she knew there was nothing she was going to be able to do with it. So she asked me a couple days before she died if I would continue to spread her message and get her book out into as many hands as I could. And of course I told her I would, but truth be told, after she died, she was my best friend, and so that grief was so heavy, and there's no way I was going to be able to market her book. But now, earlier this year, in 2011, I came to the point where I was ready. So that's what I'm trying to do, is get her book into as many hands as possible. And I feel very fortunate to have hooked up with The Day I Found Out. I think it's a great organization and a great way for people who have gone through that diagnosis and prognosis and treatment cycle of cancer, to help people who are just undergoing that. It's so, cancer touches everyone's life, and but I would imagine that you can feel totally alone once you have that diagnosis. So The Day I Found Out is a great organization, as well as for the caregivers. The caregivers are kind of the silent, I don't want to say victims at all, but the people who really keep the I don't know, they just help the cancer patients so much. And watching my dad help care for my mom, and even my sister and me, I mean, we're so much impacted. Our life was so impacted by her disease and obviously by her death. So I'm really glad that I was able to share my story, and I think The Day I Found Out is a great organization, and That's all I have for now. Thanks for listening.